The prairie stretched out like a sheet of scorched parchment beneath a low and aching sky. Wind moved across it in weary sighs, lifting dust and broken grass into restless spirals that vanished almost as soon as they were born. A lone figure rode along the horizon, his shape wavering in the heat, tall, stooped, shoulders drawn tight as if bracing against something heavier than the Sunday. His name was Eli Cutter, and the land had carved his silence into him as surely as the wind had stripped the bark from the cottonwoods. His horse limped, a sway-backed creature with ribs like the fingers of a worn-out prayer. They had been riding for days, through plains that smelled of dust and memory, and now the edge of a small town rose from the distance like a mirage, weathered building squatting in a basin of dirt, a water tower leaning east, a church bell that hadn't rung in years. Eli's mouth was dry as a bleached bone, and his pockets held little more than a few coins and a folded letter promising something he did not yet believe in. A bride bought by mail for $2. He had laughed once, years ago, when he first heard of such things, men buying wives as they might buy mules or rifles. But the laughter had turned brittle with time, and when the loneliness began to ache like a bullet buried too deep to dig out, he found himself writing to a woman he did not know. Her name was Mary Ann. She wrote with a hand both timid and clear, words laced with scripture and sorrow. She said she had nowhere to go. Neither did he. The town met him with silence. The few faces that turned his way carried the tired scorn of those who had seen too many wanderers come and go, too many promises buried under prairie dust. When he tied his horse outside the post office, a pair of old men sitting on a bench looked him over and muttered something about the fool cowboy buying himself a bride. Their laughter was dry as corn husks, brittle in the wind. Eli said nothing. He'd learned that silence, if held long enough, could shield a man better than any gun. Inside, the air was cooler, but thick with dust and old paper. The postmaster handed him a letter, its edges softened by the road. She was coming, it said. On the next train, he stared at the ink until the words blurred, then folded it back and slipped it into his coat. He had ridden all this way for a woman he had never seen, never touched, and now she was almost here, some fragile hope carried in on the rail. When the train came, it screamed across the plains like a wounded thing, steam spilling into the sky. He stood at the platform, hat in hand, heart thudding like hooves against dry ground. Passengers stepped off one by one, merchants, travelers, a preacher clutching a Bible. Then she appeared, Mary Ann, thin as a shadow, dressed in faded calico, a carpetbag held tight to her chest. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the kind of weary courage that comes from having already lost too much. She looked at him once, quiet, measuring, and then lowered her gaze. He stepped forward, unsure what to say, and settled on a nod. She returned it, the smallest tilt of her chin. No words passed between them, but something heavier than speech filled the air, an understanding, or perhaps a question neither dared to ask. They rode out from the town beneath a bruised sky. The wind carried the scent of rain that never came. Mary Ann sat stiff in the saddle, clutching the reins as if they were her last tether to the world. Eli watched her from the corner of his eye, the way her hands trembled, the way she lifted her chin despite the cold. She did not ask about the land, the cabin, or the life ahead. She only rode, silent and resolute, as if each mile stripped away a piece of her past. When they reached his homestead, a small cabin crouched against the hills, its roof patched with tin and prayer. She stared at it for a long moment, then nodded once, as though accepting the terms of some unseen bargain. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and loneliness. He lit a lantern, its flame casting soft light across the bare table, the single chair, the cot in the corner. "You can take the bed," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She looked at him, eyes steady now, and nodded. He turned away before she could see the shame rise in his face, shame that he had brought her to a place so empty it could swallow the sound of her breathing. That night, the wind howled around the cabin like a ghost calling for what it had lost. Eli lay awake on the floor, listening to the sound of her quiet sobs, each one cutting through him like the edge of a rusted knife. He closed his eyes and told himself he would make it right somehow. He would build something she could call a home, something more than silence and dust. But out here, promises were fragile things, and the land did not care who kept them. The morning broke cold and gray. the kind of dawn that carried no promise. Mist clung to the hills like ghosts reluctant to leave. Eli rose before the light, stepping outside to split wood, his breath a pale cloud in the air. The ground was hard as bone beneath his boots, and the sound of the axe echoed through the emptiness, sharp and lonely. Inside the cabin, he could hear her moving softly footsteps on the rough boards, the creak of the stove door, the rustle of fabric. It was strange, that small sound of another soul sharing his silence. When he came back in, she had water boiling and a pan of cornmeal warming. She did not speak, and neither did he, but her eyes flicked up as he entered, uncertain, searching. He nodded once, a gesture of thanks. She returned it with a faint curve at the corner of her mouth, something not yet a smile, but close enough to catch in his chest. They ate without words. Outside, the wind stirred the dry grass, whispering over the land. It was a hard place, this stretch of prairie, endless, unbending. He'd chosen it for the solitude, but now, with her there, the silence felt heavier, as if it demanded something from them both. She glanced around the cabin as they finished the meal at the bare shelves, the patched walls, the single chair by the hearth. There was no complaint in her gaze, only a quiet reckoning, as if she were measuring her own endurance against the world she had entered. Later that day, she followed him to the small field behind the cabin. The earth there was stubborn, studded with stones and choked with roots, but he'd carved out a few furrows over the years, enough to grow beans and corn in the short season. She knelt beside him without being asked, her hands sinking into the soil. It was cold and rough, and her fingers trembled, but she did not stop. He watched her, struck by the sight. This woman, fragile in frame yet fierce in will, her hair caught by the wind, her eyes set on the ground as if she could will it to yield. As they worked, a memory rose in him, his father's voice, low and steady, teaching him to read the land, to listen for what it would give. His father had died young, a fever that burned through him in a week. After that, the house emptied, and the silence took root. Eli had built walls against the world ever since, trusting no one, asking for nothing, but watching Mary Ann there, her dress streaked with dirt, her breath ragged yet steady. Something in him shifted, like a door creaking open after too many years shut tight. When the sun dipped low, they walked back to the cabin. She washed her hands in the basin, her skin raw from the cold water. He caught the faintest trace of her scent, soap and earth, clean and human. It stirred something tender in him, something dangerous. He turned away, afraid of what it might become. That night he sat by the hearth, whittling a piece of cedar into the shape of a bird. It was an old habit, a way to keep his hands busy when his mind wandered places it should not. Mary Ann sat nearby, mending a tear in her skirt. The lamplight softened the hard edges of her face, casting her in a glow that made her seem both fragile and unyielding, like a wildflower growing through stone. She spoke at last, her voice quiet, uncertain. "My father was a preacher. He said a woman should follow her husband wherever he led. I reckon he didn't mean this far." Eli looked up, startled by the sound of her words. "You had no one else?" he asked. She shook her head, eyes fixed on the fabric in her lap. "My family's gone. Fever took them last winter. The town I came from, it had nothing left. I thought maybe a new place might give me something different." He nodded slowly, the weight of her confession settling heavy in the room. "Ain't much here," he said after a long pause. "Just the land and the sky, but it's honest." She met his gaze then, steady and unflinching. "Honest is enough." For the first time he felt something like warmth stir between them, small, flickering, fragile as a candle in the wind. They sat in the quiet after that, the fire crackling, the night pressing close. He thought of the laughter in town, the way they mocked the fool who bought a $2 bride. But as he watched her hands stitch the torn fabric, steady and sure, he wondered if they had ever known what courage truly cost. Outside, the wind eased. The stars blinked awake across the dark. And for a fleeting moment, the emptiness of the plains felt less like loneliness and more like promise. The days settled for 3 days into a rhythm, quiet but certain. At dawn, they worked side by side in the fields, turning the earth, setting stakes, coaxing life from stubborn ground. She learned to tie bundles of hay, to mend fences with wire and grit, to carry water from the creek when the wind froze the pump. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached, but she did not complain. In her silence, Eli saw not weakness, but a strength forged from loss. She faced the land the way a prayer faces heaven, without expectation, only endurance. In the evenings, when the sky bled into gold and violet, they sat by the fire, the small room filled with the scent of smoke and cedar. Sometimes she read from her Bible, voice low and steady, the words like rain over dry earth. Sometimes he told her of the herds he'd once ridden with, the cattle drives that stretched across the plains for weeks on end, the nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch. He spoke of things he had not spoken of in years: his mother's song, his father's rough hands, the storm that took the roof off their first house and never gave it back. She listened without judgment, her gaze calm, her silence a shelter. As the weeks turned, something unspoken grew between them. It showed itself in small gestures: a cup of coffee left steaming on the table before dawn, a blanket tucked over his shoulders when he fell asleep by the fire, a hand steadying his arm as he limped back from the barn after a long day's work. He found himself waiting for her laughter, rare but real, like sunlight breaking through clouds. It startled him, the way her presence softened the edges of the days, how her eyes met his and did not look away. One morning, a rider came across the plains, a neighbor from 20 miles east, a man named Cole Benton. He brought word of a coming storm, fierce and sudden, moving fast across the valley. "Better tie down what you can," Cole said, glancing at Marianne, "and get the livestock to shelter. Wind like this'll tear roofs clean off." Eli thanked him, jaw set. The land had a way of testing what it was given, and he knew this would be one of those reckonings. They worked through the day, hauling feed, closing shutters, bracing the barn doors with heavy planks. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of ash, the wind picking up in sharp, restless gusts. The air smelled of rain and warning. That night, the storm came screaming across the plains, tearing through fences, hurling dust and debris against the cabin walls. The roof groaned under the force, and the door rattled like a trapped thing. Marianne clutched the lantern as Eli fought to secure the shutters, his shoulders straining against the wind. A sudden crack split the air. The barn door wrenched free, slamming wide into the darkness. "The horses!" Eli shouted, grabbing his coat. She caught his arm. "You can't! They'll break loose!" He pulled away and vanished into the storm. The wind struck him like a hammer, freezing and blinding. Rain slashed his face, and the ground turned slick beneath his boots. He fought his way to the barn, every step a battle, and threw his weight against the swinging door. Inside, the horses screamed, eyes wild with fear. He wrestled the door shut, wedged a beam across it, and turned just as the roof gave way with a thunderous crack. Something heavy struck him, and the world went dark. He awoke to silence, broken only by the faint drip of rain. The storm had passed. Pain burned through his ribs. His leg twisted beneath him. He tried to rise, but his strength failed. Then he heard her voice, soft but fierce, cutting through the haze. "Eli, Eli, where are you?" He tried to call out, but his throat was dry, his breath shallow. Moments later, she appeared in the wreckage, her dress soaked, hair plastered to her face. She knelt beside him, eyes wide with fear and determination. Without hesitation, she braced her hands beneath his shoulders and pulled. He groaned, pain flashing white, but she did not stop. Inch by inch, she dragged him through the mud, her breath ragged, her arms trembling. When they reached the cabin, she collapsed beside him, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. He lay there, shivering, staring up at her face. She was crying not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what she had done. She looked at him, her voice breaking. "You fool, man, you'd have died out there." He tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. "Didn't think you'd come." She wiped the rain from his brow, her touch gentle. "You're mine to keep alive now." In that moment, something inside him broke and healed all at once. He saw her not as a purchase, not as a stranger, but as the one soul who had walked through the storm and refused to leave him behind. Outside, the wind quieted, and dawn began to rise over the battered land. Inside, for the first time, warmth bloomed not from the fire, but from the fragile, fierce bond between two hearts, learning to beat as one. He lay in bed, his body bruised and broken, ribs cracked like old timber, leg bound tight with linen she had torn from her own dress. Mary Ann tended to him with a patience born of sorrow and grit. Her hands steady even when her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She brewed willow bark for the pain, bathed his wounds with cool water from the creek, and fed him broth from the last of their stores. Each night, she sat beside him in the dim glow of the lantern, reading softly from her Bible, or humming the faint memory of a hymn. Her voice drifted through the room like a fragile thread of light, and in the stillness he began to understand what mercy felt like. He tried to apologize once, rasping through broken breath, but she hushed him with a shake of her head. "You'd have done the same," she whispered, though they both knew few would have had her courage. She had carried him through mud and storm, through a darkness that might have swallowed them both, and in doing so, had bound their fates as surely as any vow. When he was strong enough to rise, he found her outside, mending the barn roof with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair tied back with a strip of fabric. The storm had taken much half the fence, the north wall of the shed. 2 chickens, but the horses still lived, and the cabin still stood. She turned as he limped toward her, leaning on a makeshift crutch, and the sight of him drew a faint smile across her face. "You're supposed to be resting," she said. He lowered himself onto a stump nearby, breath short but steady. "Can't rest while you're working alone." Her gaze softened, but she didn't argue. They worked side by side in silence, hammering loose boards, gathering what the wind had scattered. When the sun set, painting the plains in gold and rust, they stood together, surveying what remained. It was not much, yet it was theirs, stitched together by endurance and quiet faith. That night, as they sat by the fire, she turned to him and said, "When I left home, I thought I was trading one kind of loneliness for another. I thought maybe being someone's wife would fill the hollow. But it ain't about that, is it? It's about building something with your own hands, even if it's just a little piece of peace." He watched the firelight dance in her eyes, the way her voice carried both weariness and wonder. "You've done more than build," he said quietly. "You gave this place a soul." She looked down, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I didn't think I had much left to give." "You gave me my life," he said, voice rough with truth. "That's more than enough." The silence that followed was full, not empty. She reached across the small space between them, her hand finding his, and for a long moment neither moved. The wind outside was gentle, carrying the scent of wet earth and new grass. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote cried, low and lonely, but in the cabin the world felt still. As the days lengthened into spring, the land began to heal. Shoots of green pushed through the scarred soil, and the creek ran clearer after the storm. They rebuilt the fences, planted seeds, and painted the cabin door a soft shade of blue she'd chosen from memory. Sometimes, as they worked, he caught her singing soft tunes from her childhood, songs of rivers and home and faith. The sound threaded through the air like sunlight through clouds, quiet but fierce. The townsfolk came once to see the damage, their eyes curious, their words cautious. They still whispered of the cowboy and his $2 bride, but the laughter had gone out of their voices. They saw the way she stood beside him, steady as stone, and the way his gaze softened when it met hers. Perhaps they understood then that what had been bought with paper and coin had turned to something beyond price. One evening, after supper, Eli took a small box from beneath the bed. Inside lay a ring, simple, silver, forged by his father's hands long ago. He set it on the table, his voice quiet. "Didn't reckon I'd ever have reason to pass this on, but it's yours, if you'll take it." She stared at it, then at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You already gave me your life, Eli. I don't need a ring." He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It ain't about need. It's about truth. You saved me. You stayed. That makes you more than a bargain, Mary Ann. You're my home." Her fingers trembled as she took the ring, sliding it onto her hand. It fit as though it had waited all these years for her alone. That night, they sat on the porch beneath a sky thick with stars. The wind was soft, carrying the whisper of wheat and the promise of rain. For the first time, Eli felt the land not as a burden, but as a blessing wide, wild, and full of grace. And beside him, her hand resting in his, he understood that love, like the plains, was not born in ease or abundance, but in the hard beauty of survival. Summer arrived slow and steady, ripening the plains beneath long stretches of Sunday. The fields grew thick with corn and beans, the earth no longer stubborn but willing, softened by the hands that worked it. Marianne rose with the dawn, her dress brushed with dew, and walked the rows barefoot, humming songs that mingled with the rustle of stalks. Eli watched her sometimes from the porch, leaning on his cane, the ache in his leg a quiet reminder of the storm she had pulled him from. Her presence had changed the land as surely as the rain. What had once been barren now held promise, not through luck but through the steady labor of two souls refusing to surrender. The days found their rhythm in small, sacred patterns. They worked the soil, mended fences, shared meals of bread and beans at the rough-hewn table. In the evenings, they sat beneath the wide, painted sky, speaking little, content with the hum of crickets and the lowing of cattle in the distance. It was a quiet life, and yet every moment carried weight, as though the land itself bore witness to their bond. But peace in the frontier never lasted long. Word came from town one afternoon, a letter carried by a passing rider, sealed with the mark of a lawman from Marianne's old county. Inside, the message was sharp and cold. A man claimed to be her kin, an uncle by marriage, seeking her return. He wrote of debts unpaid, inheritance contested, property tied to her name. To him, she was not a wife or a woman reborn, but a piece of unfinished business. Marianne read the letter in silence, her face pale beneath the porch's shadow. When she finished, she folded it once, twice, and set it on the table. Eli watched her hands, steady yet trembling at the edges. "You don't have to go," he said softly. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "If I don't face him, he'll send others. The law follows men like that. They don't care what's been built here." Eli leaned forward, pain flashing in his ribs. "He's after what ain't his. I won't let him take you." Her eyes lifted to his, filled with something deeper than fear resolve. "This isn't about him. It's about me. I've run from too many ghosts, Eli. If we're to have a life worth keeping, I have to face the ones I left behind." He wanted to argue, to forbid her leaving, but the words caught in his throat. He had learned enough to know that strength did not mean possession. Love, like the land, demanded faith that what was planted would endure. 2 days later, she rode into town alone. The sky was heavy with heat, the dust rising in slow spirals around her horse's hooves. The townsfolk watched her pass, whispers trailing behind like shadows. Eli waited on the porch, the sun sinking low, his heart a restless drum. Night fell, and the lantern burned down to its wick before he heard the sound of hooves again. She returned at dawn, her hair tangled with wind, her face streaked with tears and dust. When she dismounted, he saw the letter clutched in her hand, torn in half. "It's done," she said simply. "He wanted the land my father left me. I told him it's gone, traded for a life worth more than coin. He won't follow." Eli stepped forward, his hand brushing her cheek, rough against soft. "You chose to stay," she nodded, eyes glistening. "I didn't just choose to stay. I chose us." In that moment, the air seemed to still, the prairie holding its breath. He pulled her into his arms, the scent of earth and sweat and tears binding them tighter than any vow. Around them, the land stretched endless and quiet, the wind carrying whispers of harvest and hope. As the weeks passed, they turned their eyes toward the future. Together, they raised new beams in the barn, built a second room on the cabin, and marked out a small patch of ground for flowers. In the evenings, Marianne spoke of teaching children one day, of opening a small schoolhouse in town. Eli listened, his heart steady with the knowledge that the woman once bought for $2 had given him something beyond price purpose and a place in the world. When autumn came, they stood on the ridge overlooking their field, golden and full beneath the fading Sunday. The wind moved through the grain like a hymn. Eli reached for her hand, rough fingers lacing through hers. "Reckon they ain't laughing now," he said, voice low. She smiled, eyes soft with warmth. Let them laugh. They don't know what love costs, or what it gives back. He looked out across the land, the cabin standing sturdy against the horizon, the smoke from its chimney curling into a sky vast and forgiving. In the stillness, he felt that truth settled deep. What had begun in loneliness had grown into something sacred. Not a rescue, but a rebirth. The prairie stretched before them, wide and endless, but no longer empty. It held their story now written not in ink or coin, but in labor, in faith, and in the quiet, fierce bond of two hearts made whole.